Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey and exploration through the works that are released by the Criterion collection during this year of 2021. And today, specifically, I'd like to focus our attention, if I may, on that work which has been designated the spine number 1063. This is from 1977. And please forgive me for my poor pronunciation of the Russian language, but I will do my best. This is from the filmmaker Larisa Shepitko, and the name of the work is, again, my sincerest apologies, Voskasdenia, or in English, The Ascent. This is the work from 1977. This is from the filmmaker Larisa Shepitko, and it is based upon the novel or novella, which is called Sotnikov by Vasil Bykov, and the screenplay is by Shepitko and Yuri Klepikov. And it stars, among others, Boris Plotnikov, Vladimir Gostyukin, Ludmila Polyakova, and Anatoly Solzhenitsyn. This is the work, and once again, I sincerely apologize for my very poor pronunciation. Voskasdenia, or in English, The Ascent. The Ascent is a work that I think we can describe in its essence to be about a particular point in time, namely the Nazi forces occupying this area of the world, Belarusia, and specifically focusing on the story of a group of what are described as being Soviet partisans, or two particular Soviet partisans. These are Sotnikov and Rybak, and their efforts to try to fight against the various Nazi forces that they encounter very early on. And it's not just their fight against these forces, but also their attempts to escape and evade capture. It's their attempts at trying to escape certain situations that could mean death to them and to others. So it is a very serious situation, or various forms of serious situations, that these two characters, Sotnikov and Rybak, find themselves in. And so we as viewers follow them through their struggles, which are very harrowing and very tense and quite physically demanding indeed, in terms of the depictions of their encounters through the physical wilderness, through the cold of the snow and the harshness of the environments that they encounter. But it's not just the fight, if you will, against the forces of nature. It's not just their struggles against the occupying Nazi forces, but it is also story about these two individuals and the specific encounters that they make along the way. Also their encounters with each other, and the encounters lead to various sets of circumstances that arise. Some might be circumstances that arise quite slowly and quite methodically. Other circumstances tend to arise quite suddenly and quite shockingly. And the film depicts these two characters, each of them, and also the people that they encounter along the way, and seeing how they react, how each person makes a particular choice given the very dire set of circumstances that they face, and what those choices mean, not only to themselves, but to the people around them. So, in essence, it is a story about war. It is also a story specifically about the type of choices that one must make, the hard, difficult, and really life-affecting choices that these people have to make, and what the consequences of those choices are. Again, not just for themselves, but for those around them. So, in essence, the film, The Ascent, could be described, I think, in those terms. It is a war film, and it is a very tragic and quite a physical one in terms of how the filmmaker, how Larisa Shepitko shows us the struggle and the harshness and the real bitter cold, the struggling through the snow, the coldness of the breath, but also the white expanse of the environment with barren trees and empty landscapes, but then all of a sudden there are noises in the background. What are those noises? What are those dots in the distance? Are they bits of nature? Are they aspects of the scenery? Or are they something perhaps even more sinister? The forces that are trying to apprehend them, trying to kill them. And so, and in this context we have, as I say, the story unfolding as to these two partisans and who they encounter along the way, and how that drives the story to its various inexorable points leading up to its conclusion. So that is the story of the film. But of course, as we know, a story like this in the hands of a filmmaker like Larisa Shepitko will be something quite extraordinary, and it is, because it is speaking to us on a number of different levels. So there's, of course, the visual and the extreme harshness that is being depicted, and it's this harshness that leads to this idea of the solemnity of sadness, perhaps, and the idea of tragedy, and the idea of the impact that these harsh conditions are having on the human body physically, but also on the human soul spiritually. And this word spiritually is also very important, which will lead me to another aspect, but I'll get to that momentarily. But first, we have the physical toll on these individuals. Then, of course, another level is the historical context. And so we have to remember, this is a film that is depicting a particular moment of the Second World War. And so we have the occupation of Belarusia by the Nazi forces, and we have the notion of the partisans, namely the main characters Rybak and Sotnikov, representing this aspect, but also collaborators as well as the occupying Nazi forces. And so we have this very frightening dynamic between between people who are trying to fight on the side of the partisans, but also we encounter characters along the way who, to certain degrees, we understand have collaborated with the occupying forces for various motives that become clear, or perhaps not so clear, as the film progresses. And so we have not just this historical context, but how the social fabric is affected by the various choices that are made, again, in the context of the partisans and also the collaborators, again, within the Nazi occupation. So this is the historical context, but it leads to various depictions of the moral and ethical dilemmas that face all of the characters that we meet in this film, again, in the context of war. And this is yet another level that we see. Each character, in particular, Sotnikov and Rybak, the two partisans that we follow, each character is given a set of choices depending on their particular circumstances. And we see their choices played out, again, depending on who these characters are and where they come from. Now, the film, I think, is very nuanced in trying to show us who Rybak is and who Sotnikov is. And in fact, I think the supplements that are included here are very good, excellent in fact, in trying to give us indications as to how this film might be said to be giving us clues as to the backgrounds of these various characters that we meet, including the main characters of Rybak and Sotnikov. And the selected scene commentary by Daniel Bird in particular helps to give us indications as to perhaps where these people came from prior to their experiences in wartime, thus giving us perhaps indications or clues as to yet another potential level where this film operates, namely a discussion of class dynamics, again, as exemplified by characters like Sotnikov and Rybak. And in fact, the connection between the character of Sotnikov and the character of Portnov, which is another very key character in this film, as we know, will, of course, further illuminate the possible discussion point, again, based on this idea of examination of class. And this idea of class is further augmented by the setting that we have here, the village and the villagers and their various, how their lives, their daily lives are affected. And this also includes the character of Demchika as well, which is another very key character. So this is yet another, I think, another level of examination of this film. And that leads to yet another level, which is the moral dilemma as depicted or as represented by what can be described as being the mode of the film that is a sort of modern or cinematic take on the religious parable. Now, the religious parable aspect is very important to this film because it is, I think, embedded in the concept of what can be described as being spirituality in the face of extreme hardship. And this extreme hardship is given, I think, a focus in the story and the wartime and the sadness and the depth of such sorrow and sadness that can come about from these very situations in wartime that lead to these incredibly difficult decisions, the choices that these characters make, and the consequences of those incredibly difficult decisions, against Sotnikov and Rybak in particular. And so this lays the foundation for how the film presents the parable or religious aspect of this film or this story, namely the idea of sacrifice, also the idea of spirituality linked to a sense of duty or consciousness, which is also a very key word. How these characters represent their own consciousness and how that manifests itself in the specific choices that each character makes. This is true not just of the primary characters, but also of the so-called secondary characters, those characters that we meet perhaps within a certain degree, and still they have an impact because they are also part of this religious parable equation and how it's playing itself out. Also, the allusions made to Jesus Christ and also other biblical allusions, I think, are very vivid and very effective because it also connects quite directly to this notion of the film as being a type of cinematic expression of the religious parable. And it goes even further because it's not just these very effective and very emotional allusions to our biblical allusions and allusions to Jesus Christ and the sacrifice, but also the way in which this links to the land and the people themselves and this culture themselves, and it's embedded, deeply rooted in the spirit and the character of the people that are being depicted by the cinema of Larisa Shepitko. And this goes to the notion of spirituality, I think, as described by Shepitko. This is a very key concept, and it's a very difficult one, I think, for me specifically to try to describe, because I think it's one of those concepts that is well, it's very difficult, I think, to describe. But if I were to try to rely upon, say, what Larisa Shepitko herself said in some of the materials that can be found as supplements to this particular Criterion release, which are fantastic, by the way, I think we can point to a great comment that she gives in the interview, which is, from her point of view, and I'm paraphrasing, the idea of spirituality, or an example of spirituality, is perhaps that moment in one's life where one can really take care of someone else outside of yourself. In other words, that truly selfless act, even if it's for a moment, that moment embodies or encapsulates, from the point of view of Larisa Shepitko, the concept or notion of what is spiritual. That is the essence of spirituality, perhaps. And so it's not necessarily a type of examination that is enveloped in what can be described as a type of religious iconography per se. We do get certain images or visual cues or other types of clues or hints in the film, The Ascent itself, that could be said to be akin to or remind us of specific aspects of religious iconography, don't get me wrong. But if we were to think about what might be described as being the so-called fundamentals of the essence of spirituality as provided to us by Larisa Shepitko in this film, The Ascent, it could perhaps be described, again, borrowing her words from the interview, to be this notion of the truly selfless act, something that is outside of oneself. How to capture that in cinema, and what are the emotional and what are the emotional and physical consequences of that type of endeavor, the endeavor of trying to capture something of the spiritual. And if we think about that in the context of the film The Ascent, then I think the possibilities for discussion are really quite endless, because we can talk, for example, about how these characters, these specific characters, are faced with these incredibly tough decisions, and how those decisions seem to be expressing or perhaps embodying or perhaps even allowing the characters to fantasize about situations outside of their physical body, the corporeal versus the ethereal, and how that leads into or is tied directly to the concept of physical pain and physical suffering, and how one, in the face of physical pain, might seek to try to transcend or go beyond oneself in order not just to evade the pain, but also to try to reach some kind of peace in the face of death. And in those terms, I think this film, those could be said to be some examples of how perhaps this film could be addressing this notion of spirituality, namely the selfless, or looking outside of one's physical body. And indeed, the film, in its specific plot, presents moments where we actually see characters maybe imagining themselves outside of where they actually are, maybe characters trying to deal with incredible physical pain or deal with imminent death in some way that is somehow transcending the moment, or trying to get outside of that moment to reach what might be deemed to be, for lack of a better phrase, some kind of peace before or in the face of death. And it also brings a wonderful touch in terms of the cinematic artistry that is involved, because if we think of the idea of how this film is depicting the subjective viewpoint of these particular characters, we see on the one hand the idea of depicting characters from an objective point of view. After all, these characters are being shot, they are being portrayed by actors who are being shot by Larisa Shepitko's camera and crew, and we see their viewpoint, but they are always embodied in the frame, in the camera. This is the objective way to try to express subjectivity in cinema. The subjective viewpoint, as embodied by the frame, always includes, in a very peculiar way, that character from whose perspective we are understood to be watching. So they are part of their own perspective, and in interesting way. This is true not just of the Ascent, but also of many other films, of course. But the point is that this film, I think, really, in its visual and story element, I think really very interestingly draws this line between what is truly subjective and what is the objective view of such subjectivity, for lack of a better phrase. In other words, it feels like the film, in its cinematic terms, is trying to deal with this concept of the corporeal versus the ethereal. Namely, we see the physical self, but we also get a sense of these characters, again, through cinema means. We get a sense of the characters somehow inhabiting a space outside of themselves. And again, this is due to tricks of subjectivity and objectivity that we see in cinema, but is also the way in which tones of reality are suddenly confronted by tones of real heightened reality. And I draw your attention to how sounds are used. Seemingly naturalistic sounds are suddenly engaged with by very dramatic and very bombastic and brilliant uses of music, for example. And so we have the real and the unreal, the depiction of the objective versus the subjective. And then this is, I think, linked very directly to the corporeal and the ethereal, which in turn is directly linked, shall we say, to this concept of the spiritual. And this is, I think, one of the key aspects of this film, The Ascent, and what it makes the religious parable level, I think, very effective, because it makes it, I think, part of the earth and part of the ground and part of the environment and part of that lived-in quality of these characters. And thus it comes full circle, because it brings us back to the way in which the characters inhabit the earth, how they struggle with the elements, how they struggle with the snow and the cold and the frostbite, as well as the pain and the bleeding and the panic and the fear and the notion of being scared, again, all in the face of death. So it's this wonderful way that this seemingly macro level metaphor of the religious parable at the same time becomes so intimate, and it always is tied quite directly and quite nicely to the fundamentals of the human experience. And so to conclude, I think these levels indicate very clearly, in my eyes, that this work by Larisa Shepitko, The Ascent, is a breathtaking work. It is a work filled with sorrow. It is a work filled with solemnity. It is a work filled with, yes, spirituality, and always giving us these depictions, but in very real terms that are also balanced by moments of heightened reality, otherwise known perhaps as poetry. This balance is exquisitely drawn. It is painful. It is filled with sorrow and tragedy and sadness, and also deep contemplation and thought, and also a lot of care and a lot of spirit. And this is from that great filmmaker, Larisa Shepitko. This is the film, The Ascent. The Criterion Collection Blu-ray that we have here of this film, The Ascent, is really great. Now, we should remember that Criterion did release this film in physical media form under the line which is called the Eclipse series. This was one of the films in that DVD set that was devoted to the works of Larisa Shepitko, and it's a great Eclipse set, by the way. But given that, it's really lovely to see this particular film given this individual Blu-ray release, because it's a wonderful film for the reasons that I was trying to describe earlier. But also we are given what is described as being a 4K restoration presentation of this, again on this Blu-ray, and it looks magnificent. And also we get a number of great supplements that we hadn't seen before, and so I think that makes this particular individual release Blu-ray totally worth it And ultimately, of course, you would be getting a work of art that is sublime and utterly powerful to this very day, again, from one of the great artists, Larisa Shepitko. So this is totally worth it, by the way, for the reasons that I tried to describe, and also for the supplements as well. And speaking of which, what are the supplements that we are getting with this extraordinary Blu-ray release? Excuse me. Well, first of all, we have a 17-minute or so introduction with Anton Klimov. And Anton Klimov is the son of Larisa Shepitko. And this brings us to one of the points of biography of Larisa Shepitko that is, I think, spoken of a lot. It's certainly referred to in some detail in the supplements, so it's actually quite significant for reasons that I'll also get to later. But Larisa Shepitko was married to the filmmaker Ilya Klimov, and their child, Anton Klimov, is the individual who gives this great talk, this one-on-one interview type of talk. This is described as being from 2020. And Anton Klimov talks a lot about many things. For example, the legacy of his mother, Larisa Shepitko, through a lot of the films that she made in her relatively short career, because we also know that she died tragically in an accident, and so she left this world much too soon. But what she left behind in terms of her films and her film legacy is something that Anton Klimov is trying, again, as exemplified by this interview and elsewhere, is trying to preserve for future generations to explore and discover and visit and revisit her films, the works of Larisa Shepitko, included in which, of course, is the great work Voskresenia, or the Ascent. So this introduction by Anton Klimov is so enlightening, so wonderful, and just totally worth it. So please check it out if you can. It's only approximately 17 minutes, but even in this relatively short amount of time, he gives us these very heartfelt comments about his mother, Larisa Shepitko. So the introduction with Anton Klimov from 2020. And then we have what is described as being a scene select commentary from Daniel Bird. And this commentary is not for the entire film, alas. However, it is better than nothing. And let me be even more emphatic. It is excellent. This scene select commentary by Daniel Bird is excellent, and please, when you watch the film, be sure to watch it again with the scene select commentary. You can find it in the menu of the supplements, and when you play it, it'll give you an index. It's not all the film, but it is certain select scenes, and what Daniel Bird does so magnificently is, among other things, he talks about the source material, Sotnikov, the novella Sotnikov by Vasobikov, and also he talks about certain elements that make the film a direct or faithful adaptation of the source work, but also certain areas where Shepitko diverged slightly, or perhaps not so slightly, from the underlying novella. And so he gives us these great examples of where this happens. And these examples of where there are divergences indeed indicate or highlight one or more of those levels that I was trying to describe in the first part of the video, namely the many levels upon which this film, I would argue, operate. So well done to Daniel Bird for showing us again the comparisons and points of contrast with the underlying source novella of Sotnikov. So, and there are other interesting insightful information about, or points of information about the novella itself, so just in case you are interested. But that's not all that he talks about, because Daniel Bird also focuses on Larisa Shepitko and also the reaction to the film, maybe the relationship between Shepitko and her husband Ilya Klimov, and in the context of this film, The Ascent. Also, he talks about other aspects of the filmmaking process, included in which, of course, is, for example, the music. And he talks about, it's a great score, by the way, Alfred Schnitke's score it's enthralling and it's remarkable, and the use of this again contrasted with, say, the almost sublimely quiet natural sounds that are also embodied and employed by Shepitko, really indicate a command over the cinematic artistry and the sound quality, but also the visionary, haunting nature of the music and how that fits so well, and also some great bits of information about Schnitke's biography and his own background in life. So that and other reasons are what make the Daniel Bird Select Scene commentaries so great. And he also comments about the film itself, and as I mentioned, the reaction, and there are some really great descriptions about going back to Elim Klimov. Perhaps to those of you who know Klimov, you will know perhaps one of the films that he is most famous for is a film called Come and See. And so perhaps the relationship between Shepitko and Klimov, husband and wife, of course, might invite or might make it tempting to try to find some kind of parallel between, say, the war film made by Shepitko, like The Ascent, and a war film made by Klimov, like Come and See. And in fact, Daniel Bird makes a great comment about this, about how it could be said, to borrow a phrase about how Susan Sontag described the film The Ascent as being something about the sadness of war. Perhaps one could look at Come and See as being about the horrors of war, and one can look at The Ascent as being about the sadness of war. And that juxtaposition is brilliant. It is absolutely genius. And that's, again, another example of why the Daniel Bird Scene Select commentary is essential. And I wish it could have been the entire film, the commentary track, I mean. But again, the Scene Select commentary, it's better than nothing. And I will emphasize again, it is excellent. So please check it out if you can. That is not all as far as the supplements go, because then we have a 22-minute or so interview with the actor or actress Lyudmila Polyakova, and this is Polyakova is she plays a very key character in this film, Demchika, and her character as a villager living somewhat maybe on the outskirts of this particular village, and her role as a mother, and how her interactions with these two main characters, how that affects her life and those of her children and her family. And this is the role that she plays, and we have the actor herself now speaking in this one-on-one interview fashion. So she talks about her background, how she ended up becoming an actor as well, and she gives this really great description, about how there was a point in her life, Polyakova's life, where she was interested in so many things that it was hard for her to decide exactly what she would do or what she would choose as a profession. And so ultimately she chose acting. And this is a really insightful comment, because it seems to suggest that the choice of acting for her was perhaps a means by which she could still address that aspect of her life where she was really interested in so many things and in many different possible vocations. She ended up choosing acting because perhaps that was a way in which she could express through her various roles different types of vocations that she was otherwise interested in, or perhaps potentially interested in, or perhaps a representation of the variety of things that she was interested in herself from her own biography growing up. So I found that to be extremely fascinating detail. And she also talks about her connections with the village in question here, Murom. And that also is a really fascinating detail. And she talks about working with the other actors here, like Gostyukin or Solzhenitsyn. And she also, of course, talks about working with and her impressions of the artist Larisa Shepitko, and she describes her as being Larochka, and she describes her as being this really intelligent artist, filled with power and influence, and she was this almost larger-than-life figure, Larisa Shepitko, again, from her perspective. And this type of insight into the type of artist that Larisa Shepitko was, this type of insight is so remarkable, because, again, I think, relatively speaking, of course, Shepitko's life was, she left us too soon. And her career, of course, her filmography is one that perhaps is, thanks to Blu-rays like this and other releases, perhaps, more people can begin to try to discover and explore and re-examine her works. But still, perhaps relatively speaking, say, to other filmmakers, maybe not much is known about this filmmaker. And so in that context, to get this information, again, on this personal, intimate level from an actor or performer who worked with her, is so valuable and so precious. So these are examples of why, again, this great interview is well worth checking out. If you can, please do, because it's great. Again, with Lyudmila Polyakova, again, approximately 22 minutes. That's not all, because we get also another work by Larisa Shepitko. So we get the segment that she had made in 1967, for the work The Beginning of an Unknown Era. And this is the segment, her segment, which is called The Homeland of Electricity. So this is great. This is really great to have. Now, it also, the supplements also give us a little bit of indication as to the circumstances as to this particular work's release or non-release, as it were, and that it became something that was shown much later, or in the late 1980s, thanks to the efforts of others who tried to get it exhibited. Again, this is after Larisa Shepitko had unfortunately passed away. It's approximately 38 to 40 minutes, and it's a film, or it's a story that is in essence about it's in the context of Bolshevism, and also the idea of city and countryside, and the bringing of particular, let's say, advancements of technology to a particular village that might be otherwise seen to be, quote unquote, maybe a backward, as it were, but it's much more complicated than that. It's a much more complex tale. It's also about a people, and it's also about the elements and the earthiness, and it's about electricity, and it's also about water and land and the air, and there's a harshness to the environment that's there that could be said to be speaking to or being critical of some kind of political institution that is otherwise trying to present or lead the way to what it believes to be this route of modernity. But what are the costs of such modernity? And are those roots of modernity actually reaching the people that it should be reaching? And if so, what are the consequences of that? And is there anything good that is coming out of this ultimately in the end? These are the questions that are being posed by Larisa Shepitko and others in this particular work, The Homeland of Electricity. And so, as you can see, I think we have another multi-layered work that is speaking perhaps critically in using these metaphors or images of the environment and the earth and the people and villages and the villagers and modernity, or modernity in quotes, using these as metaphors or visual cues, shall we say, to something that is, again, multi-layered and perhaps even critical. So it's an essential work, and I'm so glad this is included here as part of this package here. So we're getting many films by Larisa Shepitko, not just The Ascent, although The Ascent, of course, is well worth the price of admission. But again, we're also getting The Homeland of Electricity from 1967. That is not all, because then we get the incredibly moving portrait, if you will, approximately 20 minutes, which is called Larisa. And this is the portrait by Elem Klimov from 1970. It's described as being, in some places, from 1979. Other places it's described as being from 1980. But it's at this point that is after the untimely passing of Larisa Shepitko. And so we have Eliam Klimov, again, the husband of Larisa Shepitko, and he is giving us, in this visual portrait, if you will, a tribute to his now deceased wife. And it is incredibly moving, and it's also describing the impact that her untimely death had, not just on Eliam Klimov, but also on the people that she surrounded herself with, her circle, and also the filmmaking process, because we understand too that she was, Larisa Shepitko was in the midst of making her latest work when she unfortunately passed away when she did. And so this is this work, Larisa, is this incredibly moving and emotional visual tribute by the people who knew her, including Eliam Klimov. And so it's incredibly emotional. And please check this out if you haven't already. Again, it's approximately 20 minutes. That's not all, because we also get in the supplements included with the Criterion release something which is described as a talk with Larisa. This is described as being from 1999, and this has as its centerpiece an interview with Larisa Shepitko herself, which is conducted by Felicia von Nostitz. And it's an interview it's described as being from 1978. And prior to the centerpiece of the interview, we have a little bit of an introduction given in contemporary times, again, when this particular work was made, I understand, in or around 1999. So you have this contemporary little introduction with Eliam Klimov and Elena Rubanova, and they're talking about Larisa Shepitko, and they're also talking about the circumstances of this particular interview that we are about to see. And then it goes into the 1978 interview with Larisa Shepitko herself, and she's asked about various aspects of her career and the films leading up to the Ascent, or Voskresenia, and one of those films being Krylia, or the film in English which is referred to as Wings. And we also have specific questions about what certain scenes of particular films mean. What is the meaning behind, or what is the meaning that the artist is trying to evoke with particular moments, say in Wings or also in the Ascent, etc. This is, I forgot to mention that this work from 1999, A Talk with Larisa, was made for Russian TV, Kultura. And it's interesting too, because we sense also in Larisa Shepitko's interview comments, we sense this incredible pointed intelligence. In other words, she doesn't hesitate when she is trying to explain a particular point, or trying to, say, refute a particular point that the interviewer is questioning her about. It's not a hostile interview or anything of that nature, but it's one where I think the questions are either in line with what, say, Larisa Shepitko seems to believe her works are about, or where there is a little bit of a difference, then Larisa Shepitko is given the opportunity to create or to express her own, say, clarification about what a particular moment in a particular film of hers means, and that sort of thing. And so this interview is fascinating on a number of levels. First, it's fascinating because of the actual content itself. It's also fascinating because we see Larisa Shepitko herself speaking and being engaged with an interview, and also trying to express exactly what her works are about, including the Ascent. Also, it's fascinating because in this process, we see the type of person that she is, and you can tell that her entire being, every fiber of her soul, if you will, is devoted to the pursuit of filmmaking and cinema. And this brings me to a point that was highlighted in a number of other supplements, which is we understand from Larisa Shepitko's biography, again, as described in the supplements, that she had a very, there were parts of her life where she was facing some very difficult obstacles. Now, she was, of course, trying to make films in the Soviet era, and in the interview, she makes a reference to how she was not just trying to make films in this context, but she was also a woman who was a filmmaker trying to make films in this context. And so she does make this point in the interview. So please check out the interview if you want more insight into that from the viewpoint of Shepitko herself. But also, there were obstacles in her life where she was facing physical injury and also illness. And this affected her quite severely in terms of her physical condition, her health, and also her relationship, her personal relationships, and her filmmaking. And if we remember, too, that a film like The Ascent is one where it's obviously very demanding physically because of the harshness of the elements. And when we realize, too, that she and other members of the crew and the actors involved subjected themselves to the harshness of the environment themselves as they were making the film. This is something where we realize that in making some of the films that she did, there was a physical toll and emotional toll and a health-related toll that was caused to Larisa Shepitko. And so we realize with these and other moments that we see in the interview and elsewhere that her entire being is about cinema. Now that is a profound message about her art, if ever there was one. And so for that and for other reasons, please, if you can, please watch this interview. Again, it's called A Talk with Larisa. And also to see the contemporary reaction by Rubinova and Klimov is so emotional as well. So for those and other reasons, please check this out. It's total approximately 52 minutes. That's not all, because then we get a documentary, described as being from 2012. It's also for Russian TV Kultura, and this is called Islands, and this is approximately 40 minutes, and we get another description or discussion of the artist Larisa Shepitko, also the person Larisa Shepitko, and the family woman that is Larisa Shepitko, because we get her comments about her personal life and her artistry and her upbringing as an artist, the influence of Dovzhenko and others, and her filmmaking, let's say, quote-unquote professional relationship and personal relationship with Klimov and others. And this is so insightful and again, another great window or series of windows into the life and perspective and artistic, say, philosophy of Larisa Shepitko, as portrayed to us by those who knew her. And so please check this out if you can. Again, it's called Islands, approximately 40 minutes. Then we have another documentary, which is also described from the same time, again, also described from Kultura, 2012, which is called Larisa Shepitko and Eliam Klimov, More Than Love. And this is approximately 40 minutes. This also is talking about Larisa Shepitko and her biography as described to us by, again, those who knew her, her inner circle. And this now focuses also on the career of Eliam and the life of Eliam Klimov, her husband and filmmaker himself. And so we get a little bit of a discussion of Klimov's work and life, and then we get a discussion of Shepitko's work and her life, and then back to Klimov, and then back to Shepitko. And of course, as the years are progressing, and we see their careers and their lives progress. We understand where they met and how they married. And this is also something that is actually presents a very complex picture, I would suggest, of the relationship between Klimov and Shepitko, because there are a number of implications that are suggested by this documentary that I wouldn't say contradict what are otherwise being depicted elsewhere in the supplements, but let me just say that they at least give us a sense of complexity into their relationship that makes this part of her life, I think, all the more fascinating. So, because there are some interesting, I don't want to say questions, but there are some interesting insights into, say, what might have been the reasons for Larisa Shepitko to have wanted to marry Ilya Klimov. And also there is an idea or a sense of maybe, well, we see in other parts of the supplements how we understand that Ilya Klimov was so devoted to Larisa Shepitko, and he was so devoted to trying to maintain and preserve and promote the legacy of his now deceased wife, Larisa Shepitko. And so we get that sense of a real loving dedication to the memory of his late wife in other parts of the supplements. But here in this particular documentary, we get a perspective from other people about how their relationship might have been quite a complex one. And so, and it has a lot to do with maybe the details of their biographies, respectively. So this presentation of the relationship, I think, is very fascinatingly shown to us in this documentary. And I think a very poignant note is made by their son, Anton, because it's this idea of not just their relationship, but also what it was that Ilya Klimov wanted to give to his son in terms of the memory of his late mother. In other words, something is suggested, I think, quite implicitly, or perhaps with a lot of nuance, about how maybe Ilya Klimov was also trying to preserve the legacy of the relationship with Larisa Shepitko, not just in terms of her brilliant filmography for the world to acknowledge and to explore in the context of great cinema, but also on an intimate scale in terms of the legacy of the family life that a father wanted to preserve for his son. And in that way, I think this documentary provides a very poignant and very emotional depiction of this incredible relationship between Larisa Shepitko and Ilya Klimov. So this, and for other reasons, this is such a worthwhile documentary. Please check it out if you can. Again, the documentary about Larisa Shepitko and Ilya Klimov. Approximately 40 minutes. And with those supplements, I think you can see that we have so much that this particular release has to offer. That's not all, of course, because we also get this particular, it's the insert, which is a leaflet style, so it's a fold out. So I would have liked to have seen the staple booklet style. I do like the staple booklet, but we do get, as part of the fold out here, the great essay by Fanny Howe called Out in the Cold. Now, Out in the Cold gives us wonderful bits of biographical information about Larisa Shepitko, where she was born, her upbringing, her education, and how she entered the world of cinema, her cinematic influences, and also the film itself, and points about the film and relationship with the novella, the Bykov novella, Sotnikov, and also points about the filmmaking process. And this leads to yet another fascinating exploration and discussion by Fanny Howe of Larisa Shepitko, the artist and the filmmaker extraordinaire. That I think is another example of a great essay. I love the essays that Criterion produces for its releases, and this is another example of that, my friends. Please read this essay. It's called Out in the Cold. It does give away some details, so be sure to watch the film first if you can before reading the essay. But once you have seen the film, please check out the essay. It's totally worth it. And then we have this presentation here, and so we have the starkness or the bleakness, if you will, of the white snow environment. And then we have a particular character here, a Sotnikov, and it's a depiction or a shot or a representation of a particular moment in this film. Very important moment, and it's perhaps a visual representation of this particular title of Voskresenia, or the Ascent. And so this type of visual representation as captured by this artwork is extraordinary. And note also the font. It's this interesting way that the letters are arranged in this subtle and yet sublime way. Well done, Criterion. Well done indeed. So this is an overview, perhaps, of my thoughts and comments on this particular release by the Criterion Collection of this film by the filmmaker Larisa Shepitko. This is again called Voskresenia, or the Ascent. So if you have not had a chance to watch this film by Larisa Shepitko, please do so. Please do so. It is, for the reasons that I tried to explain, extraordinary. It is so filled with power and meaning, and the impact is one that will be felt for a long time to come after you have finished watching it, because it is that powerful and it's filled with that much resonance. This is the work, The Ascent, by Larisa Shepitko. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.